I'm the homeless veteran, and my name made the judge fall to his knees. Judge Morris Denton thought he was sentencing just another homeless vagrant when Jeremiah Cole stood before his bench in shackles. But when Deputy Noah Alvarez whispered the veteran's full name and service record, the judge's world collapsed. Some names carry the weight of a life saved, and some debts can never be repaid. The Riverside County Courthouse stood like a monument to justice on Main Street, its granite columns and brass fixtures gleaming in the morning sun. Inside, the machinery of law processed cases with relentless efficiency, drug possession, petty theft, vagrancy charges that filled the dockets of America's overburdened court system. Courtroom 4A was scheduled for another routine morning of misdemeanor cases, the kind of proceedings that rarely drew public attention or media coverage. Judge Morris Denton had presided over this courtroom for 18 years, building a reputation for swift justice and zero tolerance for repeat offenders who clogged the system with their persistent failures to conform to society's expectations. Jeremiah Cole shuffled into the courtroom wearing the uniform of America's Invisible Army, torn jeans held together with safety pins, a jacket that had once been military green but was now faded to an indeterminate gray, and boots that were more holes than leather. At 68, he carried himself with the ghost of military bearing, but decades of homelessness had worn him down like water-eroding stone. His most precious possession was a crumpled envelope in his jacket pocket containing his discharge papers and a Silver Star citation documents that proved he had once been someone important, someone who mattered. But the paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded, and the man described in those official records seemed like a stranger from another lifetime. The courtroom spectators, social workers, family members of other defendants, curious citizens fulfilling jury duty, looked at Jeremiah with the mixture of pity and disgust that society reserves for its most visible failures. To them, he was just another homeless veteran who had failed to get his life together, another burden on taxpayers, another reminder of problems they preferred not to acknowledge. Jeremiah faced charges of criminal trespass and public intoxication. He'd been found sleeping in the doorway of a closed restaurant seeking shelter from a winter storm that had dropped temperatures below freezing. It was his fourth such arrest in 2 years, which meant he was looking at serious jail time under the county's aggressive anti-vagrancy policies. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Mitchell, saw Jeremiah as exactly what his file indicated, a repeat offender whose pattern of behavior demonstrated a willful disregard for law and order. She had no interest in his backstory, his service record, or the circumstances that had led him to the streets. The people versus Jeremiah Cole. The bailiff announced as Jeremiah was led to the defendant's table in handcuffs and leg shackles. The chains rattled with each step, a sound that echoed through the courtroom like a death knell for dignity. Judge Denton barely looked up from his paperwork as he reviewed the charges. Criminal trespass, public intoxication, violation of probation from previous vagrancy convictions. It was a familiar pattern that he'd seen hundreds of times before. Another homeless individual cycling through the system, costing taxpayers money with each arrest and court appearance. Mr. Cole, Judge Denton said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had processed too many similar cases, you're charged with criminal trespass and public intoxication. How do you plead? Jeremiah's court-appointed attorney, overwhelmed with a caseload of 67 active cases, had spent exactly 8 minutes reviewing his file. The strategy was simple: plead guilty to reduce charges, accept whatever sentence the judge imposed, and move on to the next case. Your Honor, the attorney said, my client pleads no contest to the charges and throws himself on the mercy of the court. Assistant District Attorney Mitchell rose from her chair with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. At 32, she had built her career on tough prosecution of quality-of-life crimes, believing that aggressive enforcement was the key to maintaining social order. Your Honor, Mitchell began, her voice carrying across the courtroom. Mr. Cole represents everything wrong with our approach to chronic homelessness. This is his fourth arrest in 2 years for similar offenses. He has shown a complete disregard for the law and a willful refusal to seek help through appropriate social services. She gestured toward Jeremiah with barely concealed contempt. The defendant is a burden on taxpayers, a threat to public safety, and a perfect example of why we need to get tough on vagrancy. I recommend the maximum sentence allowed by law, 1 year in county jail, with no possibility of early release. The words hit Jeremiah like physical blows. He had served his country with honor, had earned decorations for valor, had once been trusted with the lives of other soldiers. Now he was being described as a burden, a threat, a waste of taxpayer money by someone young enough to be his daughter. Judge Denton looked at Jeremiah with the cold assessment of someone who had made up his mind before hearing the evidence. Here was another homeless veteran who had failed to adjust to civilian life, another example of the system's inability to solve complex social problems through traditional legal remedies. Mr. Cole, Judge Denton said, his voice carrying the authority of 18 years on the bench, you've been before this court multiple times for similar offenses. You've had opportunities to seek help to change your behavior to become a productive member of society. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. Instead, you've chosen to continue this pattern of criminal behavior. You've shown contempt for the law and disregard for the rights of property owners and business people who are trying to make an honest living. Jeremiah tried to speak to explain that he hadn't been drinking, that he'd only been seeking shelter from the storm, that he was a decorated veteran who deserved basic human dignity. But Judge Denton cut him off with a wave of his hand. I've heard enough excuses, Mr. Cole. The court sentences you to 1 year in county jail. Bailiff removed the defendant. Deputy Noah Alvarez had been working courthouse security for 5 years, long enough to recognize the difference between career criminals and people who had simply fallen through society's cracks. Something about Jeremiah Cole nagged at him, the way the old man carried himself despite his circumstances, the military bearing that showed through even in shackles, the quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his appearance. After Jeremiah was led away to begin his sentence, Alvarez found himself thinking about the case. He'd seen hundreds of homeless defendants processed through the system, but few had maintained the kind of composure Jeremiah had shown, even while being condemned as a burden on society. That evening, Alvarez decided to do something he'd never done before. He looked up Jeremiah's military service record. What he found in the Department of Defense database made his blood run cold. Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Cole, United States Army, had served with distinction in Operation Desert Storm, earning a Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in combat. The citation described how Sergeant Cole had single-handedly held off an enemy assault while evacuating wounded soldiers, including a young lieutenant who had been trapped under enemy fire. The lieutenant's name was Morris Denton. Alvarez stared at his computer screen in disbelief, reading and rereading the citation that described Jeremiah's heroism. The details were specific and harrowing during a reconnaissance mission near Khafji. Sergeant Cole's unit had been ambushed by Iraqi forces. When Lieutenant Denton was wounded and pinned down by enemy fire, Cole had crawled 150 meters through a minefield to reach him. Under heavy fire, Cole had carried the wounded lieutenant to safety, then returned to the battlefield to evacuate 3 other wounded soldiers. His actions had saved 4 lives and allowed his unit to complete their mission. For his extraordinary heroism, he had been awarded the Silver Star, one of the military's highest decorations for valor. The lieutenant whose life had been saved was now Judge Morris Denton, the same man who had just sentenced Jeremiah to a year in jail for seeking shelter from a storm. Alvarez felt sick to his stomach as he realized what had just happened. A decorated war hero who had saved the judge's life 34 years ago had been condemned as a burden on society by the very man who owed him everything. The irony was devastating, but more than that, it was a profound injustice that demanded immediate correction. Unable to sleep, Alvarez spent the night researching everything he could find about Jeremiah Cole's military service and subsequent life. The picture that emerged was both inspiring and heartbreaking, a genuine American hero who had been failed by every system designed to help him. After Desert Storm, Jeremiah had continued his military career, serving in peacekeeping missions in Bosnia and Somalia. He had been promoted to Master Sergeant and had earned numerous commendations for leadership and bravery. His service record was exemplary, marking him as exactly the kind of soldier the military held up as an example for others. But Jeremiah's problems had begun after his retirement from the Army in 2003. Like many veterans, he had struggled with PTSD and survivor's guilt conditions that were poorly understood and inadequately treated at the time. His marriage had failed, his job prospects had dwindled, and gradually he had slipped through the cracks of a system that was unprepared to deal with the invisible wounds of war. The VA had lost track of him during one of his many moves. His benefits had been suspended due to bureaucratic errors, and his attempts to navigate the complex system had been frustrated by red tape and indifference. By dawn, Alvarez had made a decision that would change multiple lives. He couldn't allow Judge Denton to continue in ignorance of who Jeremiah Cole really was and what he had done. The judge had a right to know that he had just sentenced his own savior to jail, and Jeremiah had a right to have his service recognized and honored. Alvarez arrived at the courthouse early before the morning docket began and requested an urgent meeting with Judge Denton. The judge was initially reluctant to discuss a case that had already been decided, but Alvarez's insistence and obvious distress convinced him to listen. "Judge Denton," Alvarez said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I need to tell you something about Jeremiah Cole that you need to know. He's not just another homeless vagrant. He's a decorated war hero, and according to his military records, he saved your life in Desert Storm." The words hit Judge Denton like a physical blow. He stared at Alvarez in disbelief, his mind racing back to that terrifying day in the Saudi desert when he thought he was going to die, when a sergeant had appeared like an angel and carried him to safety. "That's impossible," Judge Denton whispered, but even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't. Judge Denton sat in his chambers staring at the military records Deputy Alvarez had brought him, his hands trembling as he read the citation that described his own rescue. The memories came flooding back: the ambush, the searing pain of the bullet wound, the certainty that he was going to die in that desert wasteland, thousands of miles from home. He remembered the face of the sergeant who had crawled through enemy fire to reach him, the calm voice that had told him everything would be okay, the strong arms that had carried him to safety while bullets whistled overhead. That sergeant had been Jeremiah Cole, and Judge Denton had just sentenced him to a year in jail for the crime of being homeless. The irony was crushing, but worse than the irony was the realization of how completely he had failed as both a judge and a human being. He had looked at Jeremiah and seen only what he expected to see: another homeless vagrant, another burden on a society, another problem to be processed through the system and forgotten. He had never looked deeper, never asked about Jeremiah's background, never considered that the broken man before his bench might once have been a hero. He had allowed his prejudices and preconceptions to blind him to the truth, and in doing so, he had committed a profound injustice against the very man who had given him the gift of life. Judge Denton's first instinct was to immediately reverse Jeremiah's sentence and order his release, but the legal system doesn't allow for such simple corrections. Once a sentence has been imposed and the defendant has been remanded to custody, overturning that decision requires proper legal procedures and justification. The district attorney's office, led by Sarah Mitchell, initially resisted any attempt to reopen the case. Mitchell argued that Jeremiah's military service, while commendable, didn't excuse his criminal behavior or justify special treatment. "We can't have a two-tier justice system," she insisted, "where some defendants get different treatment based on their past achievements." The county sheriff responsible for housing Jeremiah in the jail was concerned about the precedent of releasing inmates based on post-conviction discoveries about their backgrounds. "If we start second-guessing every sentence based on new information about defendants' histories," he argued, "will undermine the entire system." But Judge Denton was determined to correct his mistake regardless of the bureaucratic obstacles. He began researching legal precedents for post-conviction relief, looking for any mechanism that would allow him to undo the injustice he had committed. He consulted with other judges, spoke with legal scholars, and explored every possible avenue for reversing Jeremiah's sentence. The challenge was not just legal, but moral. How do you correct a mistake of such magnitude? How do you restore dignity to someone you have publicly humiliated? How do you acknowledge a debt that can never be repaid while maintaining the integrity of the judicial system? Judge Denton realized that simply releasing Jeremiah wouldn't be enough. The injustice had been public witnessed by a courtroom full of people who had seen a war hero condemned as a burden on society. The correction would have to be equally public, equally dramatic, and equally memorable. That night, Judge Denton couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the young lieutenant he had been in 1991, scared, wounded, certain he was going to die in a foreign desert. He remembered the profound gratitude he had felt toward the sergeant who had saved him, the promise he had made to himself to never forget that act of heroism. But he had forgotten. Over the years, as he built his legal career and climbed the ladder of success, the memories of Desert Storm had faded into the background. He had become comfortable, complacent, insulated from the struggles of people like Jeremiah, who had given everything for their country and received little in return. The realization that he had sentenced his own savior to jail was devastating, but it was also a wake-up call about the kind of judge and the kind of man he had become. He had lost sight of the values that should guide both justice and human decency, had allowed his position of power to make him callous to the suffering of others. Judge Denton understood that correcting this injustice would require more than legal maneuvering. It would require a fundamental acknowledgement of his failure and a public act of contrition that would restore not just Jeremiah's dignity, but the integrity of the judicial system itself. Judge Denton worked through the night researching every possible legal mechanism for overturning Jeremiah's conviction. He found precedent in cases where new evidence had come to light after sentencing, where fundamental errors in the judicial process had been discovered and where the interests of justice demanded extraordinary remedies. The key was Rule 35 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, which allows courts to correct illegal sentences, and the broader principle of judicial discretion in cases where manifest injustice has occurred. Judge Denton prepared a comprehensive legal brief arguing that Jeremiah's sentence was fundamentally unjust given the circumstances and his previously unknown service record. He also contacted the Veterans Administration and the Department of Defense and several veterans organizations to verify Jeremiah's service record and gather support for his release. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Military officials, veterans, advocates, and legal experts all agreed that a decorated war hero should not be serving jail time for seeking shelter from a storm. Most importantly, Judge Denton reached out to his former commanding officer from Desert Storm, Colonel Robert Hayes, who confirmed the details of the ambush and Jeremiah's heroic actions. Hayes agreed to testify on Jeremiah's behalf if necessary. Judge Denton scheduled an emergency hearing for the following morning, citing newly discovered evidence that materially affected the case. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, veterans advocates, and curious citizens who had heard about the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Jeremiah's case. Jeremiah was brought from the county jail, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, confused about why he was being returned to court so soon after his sentencing. He had spent the night in a cell with hardened criminals trying to understand how his life had come to this point. Deputy Alvarez had briefed him on what Judge Denton had discovered, but Jeremiah found it hard to believe that anyone cared about his military service after all these years. He had been dismissed and forgotten by so many people that the idea of recognition seemed impossible. As he entered the courtroom, Jeremiah saw something he hadn't expected: respect in the eyes of the people watching him. Judge Denton began the hearing with an unprecedented statement that would be remembered in legal circles for decades to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I have called this emergency hearing to address a grave injustice that occurred in this courtroom yesterday." He looked directly at Jeremiah, who sat at the defendant's table, still wearing jail clothes and shackles. "The man before us is not the burden on society that he was portrayed to be. He is Staff Sergeant Jeremiah Cole, United States Army, a decorated war hero who earned the Silver Star for extraordinary heroism in Operation Desert Storm." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps as Judge Denton continued. "On March 2, 1991, Sergeant Cole risked his life to save 4 wounded soldiers, including a young lieutenant who was trapped under enemy fire. That lieutenant was me." The revelation hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt, and several people audibly gasped at the dramatic irony of the situation. Judge Denton stepped down from his bench, his judicial robes rustling in the absolute silence of the courtroom. What he did next was unprecedented in the annals of American jurisprudence. He walked directly to where Jeremiah sat in shackles and slowly, deliberately fell to his knees before the man who had saved his life. "Sergeant Cole," Judge Denton said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I have committed an unforgivable injustice against you. You saved my life in Desert Storm, and I repaid that debt by sentencing you to jail for the crime of being homeless. I failed you as a judge, as a human being, and as the man whose life you preserved." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Judge Denton continued, still on his knees before Jeremiah. "I looked at you and saw only what I expected to see: a vagrant a burden, a problem to be solved. I never saw the hero, the decorated soldier, the man who crawled through enemy fire to save others. I am profoundly sorry, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make this right." Jeremiah stared down at the judge kneeling before him, tears streaming down his weathered face. After years of being invisible, dismissed and forgotten, he was finally being seen for who he really was. Judge Denton rose to his feet and returned to his bench, but his demeanor had completely changed. He was no longer the stern jurist dispensing harsh justice, but a man humbled by his own failure and determined to correct it. "The conviction of Jeremiah Cole is hereby overturned," he announced. "All charges are dismissed with prejudice, and his record will be expunged. Furthermore, this court formally recognizes Sergeant Cole's service to our nation and apologizes for the treatment he has received." He ordered Jeremiah's immediate release and the removal of his shackles. "Sergeant Cole, you are free to go with the profound gratitude of this court and this community. Your service will never be forgotten again." The bailiff approached Jeremiah with the key to his shackles, but his hands were shaking so badly that Deputy Alvarez had to help him remove the restraints. As the chains fell away, Jeremiah stood straighter than he had in years, his military bearing returning as his dignity was restored. What happened next was spontaneous and overwhelming. Someone in the gallery began to applaud, and within seconds the entire courtroom was on its feet in thunderous ovation. Veterans in the audience saluted civilians, clapped until their hands hurt, and even court officers joined in the tribute to a forgotten hero who had finally been recognized. Judge Denton stood at his bench and rendered a crisp military salute to Jeremiah, holding it for a full 10 seconds while the applause continued. The image of a federal judge saluting a homeless veteran would be captured by photographers and shared around the world, becoming a symbol of justice, delayed but not denied. Jeremiah returned the salute with the precision of the soldier he had always been, his back straight, his eyes clear, his dignity fully restored. For the first time in decades, he felt like the man he used to be, a hero, a protector, someone who mattered. Jeremiah Cole walked out of the courthouse a free man, but more than that, he walked out as a recognized hero whose service had finally been acknowledged. The Veterans Administration, alerted to his case, immediately restored his full benefits and provided him with housing, health care, and the support services he had been denied for years. Judge Denton personally ensured that Jeremiah received every benefit and recognition he was entitled to, including back pay for the benefits he had been wrongfully denied. The local VFW post made him an honorary member and provided him with a permanent place in their Hall of Honor. Most importantly, Jeremiah's story sparked a nationwide review of how the justice system treats homeless veterans. The Jeremiah Cole Protocol was established in courts across the country, requiring judges to consider military service records before sentencing veterans and providing resources to connect former service members with appropriate support services rather than simply processing them through the criminal justice system. The case became a catalyst for broader reforms in how society treats its veterans, particularly those struggling with homelessness and mental health issues. Congress passed legislation increasing funding for veteran support services and requiring better coordination between the VA local courts and social service agencies. Judge Denton became a leading advocate for veterans courts and restorative justice programs, using his experience with Jeremiah to educate other judges about the importance of looking beyond appearances to understand the full humanity of the people who appear before them. The story was featured in legal journals, military publications, and mainstream media as an example of how the justice system could be both humbled and redeemed by acknowledging its failures and working to correct them. Law schools began using the case as a teaching tool about the importance of judicial humility and the danger of prejudgment. Jeremiah Cole spent his remaining years as an advocate for homeless veterans, sharing his story and helping others navigate the systems that had failed him. He never forgot the moment when Judge Denton fell to his knees before him, calling it the day his dignity was restored and his service was finally honored. Judge Denton and Jeremiah developed a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how justice could fail and how it could be redeemed. Their story became a testament to the power of recognition, redemption, and the idea that it's never too late to acknowledge the heroes who walk among us, even when they're hidden by circumstances beyond their control.